All right, we're going to start this wonderful PreVeil CMMC Summit. Let me stop sharing the introductory slide and hand it over to you, my friend, Sanjeev Verma.
Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to PreVeil's second annual CMMC Summit, where we are very grateful and proud to bring leading authorities on cybersecurity and compliance drawn from public and private institutions to share their perspectives on cybersecurity and upcoming changes and compliance initiatives, including CMMC. I regret to inform you that Mr. Carlton Johnson recently just informed us that he has had a very serious family medical emergency that he's tending to as we speak. We wish him well. We have a very distinguished panel of keynote speakers, and kicking off our keynote today is Robert Metzger, an attorney in private practice. Bob is widely regarded as one of the nation's absolutely top cybersecurity, compliance, and federal contracts attorneys. As a testimony to that fact, he was counsel of record for Microsoft Corporation in their federal claims court litigation over the multi-billion-dollar JEDI litigation. He advises top technology companies in enterprise strategy and compliance matters, and is also a consultant to the MITRE Corporation, a federally funded R&D center. He's co-author of the 2018 Uncompromised report, which focused on security of the defense industrial base. And I personally can attest to the fact that few understand DFARS and the CMMC program better than Bob, and to hear his perspective on those, it is my pleasure to welcome Bob to our keynote. Welcome.
Thank you, Sanjeev. It's my privilege to be a part of this seminar and to be among the keynoters with such distinguished and accomplished colleagues. The 2018 Deliver Uncompromised report is something that's worth reading, even if it sounds like it was some time ago. It essentially looked across the span of vulnerabilities and the vectors through which adversaries could mount cyber supply chain attacks. It concluded, unsurprisingly, that the defense industrial base was not doing an adequate job in protecting information or information security. It also looked at whether the self-attestation regime that DoD had relied upon was working, and the answer was no. And so that report recommended that DoD look to create means to get what we called cyber integrity scores, or security integrity scores. And that contributed, for good or for bad, good I hope, to what has become CMMC. So I'm a bit of a stakeholder in the success of DoD's increasing challenging efforts to improve the security of its industrial base. But I want to talk not just about DoD and its contractors. I want to talk a little bit more broadly about enterprises who are at risk of cyber attack, whether it be at the instigation of a nation state or a ransomware criminal or group of criminals. Everyone is vulnerable. Others will talk about that more. But I want us to remember that the adversaries who can do and will attack us are not limiting their attacks to those who are in the defense industrial base. They're not limiting them to higher institutions of higher education. They are looking at anyone who might be a target for reasons that might include exfiltration or theft of data, as well as the criminal gain through payment of a ransomware demand. The world we live in is a tough and painful world. The security situation that gave rise to Deliver Uncompromised 3 years ago is no better. In fact, it is worse on virtually every count, and that's the world we live in. So at a high level, I'd kind of like to talk about where we are in DoD's accomplishment of security, what it presently requires from its contractors and higher educational institutions who receive DFARS clauses. Obviously, everybody's interested in CMMC. DoD's been pretty quiet on it. We know changes are coming. We'll talk about that. I want to also discuss kind of why companies should act now and not wait. And then I want to suggest what might be consequences that you really would face if you decline to act now. So let's begin with the current requirements. Everyone on this call or this program probably knows that DoD has this 7012 contract clause that requires companies to have adequate security in a dynamic environment. And adequate security is essentially measured by the special publication 171 from NIST. That's the baseline, and that is a requirement. There are 110 individual requirements that are allocated into security families by SP 800-171. I see no reason to believe that any of those things are going away. And so as a starting point for every company that intends to do business really with any part of the federal government, you should be focusing on what you achieve to meet each of those 110 requirements and what you're going to do to sustain that or improve it or close any gaps as the security environment continues to change. We should also remember that there's a second part to 7012 that often gets less recognition, and that is the requirement that companies are to report incidents to DoD, to the DC3 unit, within 72 hours of detection. Well, my information is that relatively speaking, very few incident reports have been made to DC3. I suspect that at larger companies, there may be hundreds of indicators of a cyber challenger attack every day. And yet the number of reports that have been made to DC3 are small. Now, if we go back and we take a look at that May 12th executive order of the president, 14028, one can see without any question the insistence of the president, which has been acted upon by both, is being acted upon by both Congress and the executive branch, that companies do a better job reporting. We can't defend what we don't know. We can't act upon newly emerged threats unless we know about them, can assess and come up with means to respond and distribute that information. Incident reporting is key. Another thing to recognize in the current state of affairs is the presence of what are the requirements of the 7019 and 7020 clause. These are the ones which require companies to have a system security plan and to perform a self-assessment using DoD's prescribed methodology, and to report to the SPRS system, Supplier Performance Review System, their scores. You have to report your score to SIPRs, and yes, you also have to describe when you expect to close any gaps that have been found in your plan of action and milestone. Those are submitted to a government system where that information is made available to a contracting officer who at the very least may consider it to determine whether you are a presently responsible contractor. When we talk a little bit later about DOJ initiatives to increase the use of the False Claims Act in cyber areas, you'll see why those submissions to SIPRs acquire an increased importance. All of the things that I have described in the last few moments are in place. There is no reason to expect that any of those requirements will go away. I see no reason to expect that there will be any material changes or a relaxation of the basic security obligation of 7012, a reliance upon 171 as the baseline for security methods, of the obligation to do a self-assessment, make a SIPRS, come up with a SIPR score, report it, advise of a POAM. And so if anyone thinks that because CMMC has been slow to roll out, that somehow they are excused from doing the things that DoD expects, they are wrong. Because actually, CMMC was always really in the future. There was a third clause, the 7021 clause, that said in effect that, if you see me in your contract and your contract tells you that you have to be subject to an assessment and certification, well, then you will. But no contract has actually had that requirement. CMMC was being built while the 7021 clause was in place. It is still being built. But irrespective of the fate of CMMC, which I will turn to momentarily, all those other requirements in place. And not only are they in place for defense contractors, we should all recognize that other federal agencies similarly have an interest in the security of the information that they entrust to contractors or grantees. We can't miss it. I mean, it's referenced in the executive order. It's certainly a subject that's in this new DOJ Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative. So let's talk about CMMC. Look, it was incredibly ambitious. It was too ambitious. I mean, if you look back at what we were being told to expect a year and a half ago, The fact is that the reach of this exceeded the resources. Coming up with the means to have accredited third-party assessors who could cover several tens of thousands of companies, even in the first 5 years of rollout, and do assessments against a complex set of maturity level requirements. I mean, this was an idealized view of what could happen and maybe what should happen, but never something that was actually realistic or pragmatic. It's not that the concept is bad. It's not that DoD should abandon the idea of assessing contractors, but you have to be realistic and pragmatic. And so I think that when DoD announces its changes, what we're going to see are acts that rationalize CMMC. We'll see less demand made upon smaller companies, at least some of them. We'll see much less demand upon companies who do not have or use controlled unclassified information. We'll see a focus upon 171 rather than the CMMC maturity levels. We'll also see that there'll be, I think, a prioritization of where DoD will expect assessment and certification. We'll also see some changes in the relationship between DoD and the accreditation body so that industry can have more trust in its integrity, and so that DoD has responsibility for what should be government actions rather than this private organization. We're certainly going to see some means taken to help smaller businesses. Now, these are going to be complex things, and then some of them are going to be quite different from the way that CMMC has been articulated so far. So what this means at the rulemaking level is that the present interim rule may be finalized to focus upon the 19 and 20 self-assessment requirements. But I would expect that there will be a new rule that will propose bigger and different changes to CMMC, and those regulations can't come out for a year or so. Again, does that mean, if there's new rulemaking, does that mean that we all go to all stop now? I hardly think that is advisable. Nothing in the threat world is going to abate while our rulemaking process takes its time. So you have to be smart and work ahead, work to protect yourself. Some of it is to be in compliance with regulations today and accepted, and some of it is just a basic measure of business prudence, good judgment, because if you don't protect your enterprise, what will you have in that enterprise if you are successfully attacked? And if I were talking to the whole of the community here, I would say that you ought to be looking at the sensitivity of the information that you have, the importance of that information to your customers, where you fit into the supply chain of high impact programs or critical functions. If you are lower on that scale, even if you have controlled unclassified information, you may be subject to assessment a little bit later, and it's conceivable that there will be even lower requirements for security. But if you look at yourself realistically and what you do is important, your information is valuable, it would be bad to DoD if you were taken offline by a ransomware attack, or harmful to the country if your information were exfiltrated by the Chinese or another adversary. Well, if you start to hit some of those buttons, whether you're a university, a college, or anybody else, then you have to expect that DoD will demand that you are secure and that you can show it, and that assessment very likely will be in your future. When? I don't know. And there's every reason to act now and prudently, not extravagantly, to protect yourself. So, what is to come? The security environment essentially defines why we're here. And on the Defense Science Board, where I've served on one task force on cyber supply chain, often employs a formula for risk, which is a function of threat and vulnerability and consequence. And others on this panel, such as Mr. Carmichael, can talk a lot more about threat and vulnerability, and so too can General Cardon and consequence. I can say from work that I've done for MITRE and with companies that there is absolutely no reason to think that there has been any abatement of any of threat or vulnerability or consequence. In all of those areas of risk, we see situations that are more difficult, more complex, more threatening. We've seen a new dispersal or diversity of threat actors as criminal enterprises have found that ransomware is such a successful business model. And they are not looking just to steal your information, although they may. They are looking to deny you access to your system and to steal your information, and potentially to make that information public should you not pay the ransomware, or perhaps even if you do. And if you're looking at both, threats from nation states as well from criminal enterprises, it becomes just essential that you take measures to be sure that you can be in business without interruption and that you do effectively protect sensitive information, including that of your customers and employees, should you be the victim of a ransomware attack. Now, who is affected by this within an organization? Well, many of you have persons who are responsible for governance, risk, and compliance. And all of those functions are implicated by the present threat environment. The governance people should appreciate that, if you are a public company, or if you are accountable to shareholders or to investors, or if you're expected by your primary customers to be secure, if they're looking at their supply chain vulnerabilities and you're in that supply chain, well, they are going to want to know that you are secure. And your governance people internally will want confidence that you can defend against any assertions should they occur and protect against events so that you don't have to defend. The people who are responsible for risk management in companies, well, they should realize the panoply of threats as well as the regulatory and contract requirements make it essential to take acts that are cognizant of the present state of security affairs and adaptive as new threats emerge. This is never, ever going to be a static place. We will never get to a place where you have done enough and you can rest on what you've done. I know that's going to be expensive. It doesn't mean that you have to take extravagant actions. It means you have to be smart to take actions to protect what is most important to your business, to your customers, to your employees, to the persons whose records you may hold. There are many choices out there. It isn't something that has to bankrupt or drain any company, but choosing nothing, in the contrast to the many choices of sensible means to improve your security over time, not a good plan, because it's going to put at risk all of these three functions: governance, risk, and compliance. Let's talk about compliance just for a moment. Within the last 3 weeks, the Department of Justice has announced a new civil cyber fraud initiative, and they seem to mean it. And what they're looking, they've said specifically that there are 3 or 4 things where they're going to be looking for that might be grounds to pursue recovery for civil fraud. Now, all these things concern most the protection of government information and government systems where contractors are involved. They are interested in knowing failures to comply with cybersecurity standards. They are interested in knowing misrepresentation of security controls and practices. They're interested in knowing failure to monitor your system. And they are also interested in knowing failure to timely report suspected breach. Now let's just pause and think about those. If you apply those 4 principles or precepts to the range of activities that are required just by the DFARS clause, you can see that there are many, many opportunities for people to decide not to do things or to do things they shouldn't. There are, if you are submitting a score to SIPRs and it's not right, if you are submitting a planned closure date of your gaps to SIPRs and you're not going to do it, you are taking a risk of being subject to a False Claims Act investigation or suit. And I got to tell you, part of my legal practice as a litigator has involved defending companies against actions brought under the False Claims Act. You do not want to be there. I mean, even if the allegations have absolutely no merit, it is an incredibly disruptive and expensive experience to defend against a False Claims Act. And if you are found liable, even if there's no proof of actual damage suffered by the government, the civil fines and penalties can mount up, can be enormous. Don't take that chance. And your governance, risk, and compliance people, as they become alert to the cyber civil fraud initiative, they're going to want everybody involved in cyber decision making to be more careful and to better document decisions. If hard decisions are made, don't do nothing. Don't think that a blind eye or reckless disregard of what you could know and could do is going to will immunize you. It won't, because there is a way that false claims actions can be brought if you are act in reckless disregard of what you should do or what you should know. Now, if you weren't, it isn't that you're likely to receive a subpoena from the Justice Department or an Inspector General, right? I mean, there are relatively few of them, and the cases so far have been relatively few. But what the DOJ has also done recently is to explicitly encourage whistleblowers to come to them with allegations or concerns about civil, cyber, false claims or fraud. They've set up a special hotline so that those whistleblowers can bring cyber concerns to the government's attention. And the whistleblowers can be a vice president, they can be somebody in the CISO, they could be a consultant. And look, I have real life experience working for real companies who are facing sometimes difficult decisions in how to respond to one or another requirement, or how to react in response to one or another form of incident. And in some situations, there can be disagreements as to what to do. Well, you better be sure that those disagreements are resolved satisfactorily. You better be sure that you document the reasons for a decision that may be contentious internally. Because if you deliberately take that blind eye to cyber threats, if you deliberately decide not to report to DC3 or otherwise, if you deliberately misrepresent your score and SIPRs, well, if there's somebody who's unhappy with that, they now have a clear path to be a whistleblower, to bring that to the attention of justice. And even if they don't bring a suit against you as a whistleblower, relator, even if justice doesn't actually bring a suit against you, they could well investigate you, and you do not want that to happen. So where in doubt, be prudent, take acts. So, is there some reason to think that, we really should wait and see what DoD does? I think I've pretty much answered that. DoD is likely to find smarter and better ways to improve your cybersecurity. They're already interested, of course, in controlled unclassified information, but there are other things that are interesting them too. Will interest them too. And you can expect you may have less intrusive regulation. It may be less difficult to do in the near term. There may be fewer people who are subject to the immediate assessment demands, but these things are not going away. And so what do you do now? I've got a couple of quick recommendations. One is that you identify your critical information and assets, and you do what you can to protect it. That doesn't mean unnecessarily extravagant expenditures. Doesn't mean that you spend what you can't afford, but there are ways in which you can identify and protect the things that matter most. You also want to think about identifying your sensitive intellectual property and data, finding ways to segregate that. In the same vein, to the extent that you are relying upon perimeter security, you might want to introduce network segmentation so that if someone is able to penetrate your network from the outside, they're limited in where they can go within it. The executive order makes reference to zero trust architecture, and that's a really important principle for everyone to understand, because it essentially assumes that your perimeter could be or will be breached, and it's looking on a transaction basis to determine whether the person or the use at the time and in the way suggested is something that's authorized. You're going to be drawn toward this because it's the only way to protect against the diversity and the skill of present adversaries. Encryption has a place. I've been doing some study now of ransomware in a public-private sector project. And ransomware, of course, gives great vulnerability to the information that you keep, but that vulnerability is much reduced if the information is encrypted. If the ransomware attacker can't use it, can't see it, can't disclose it, if it means nothing if they were to attempt to sell it, well, that has a tendency to, I hope, to discourage a ransomware attack. And in the same vein, to the extent that you are able to, you should constantly be vigilant on finding ways to get your sensitive information off of your system, backed up in a way that is both secure and can be promptly restored in a fashion that is trustworthy. Encryption has a place there. While we're waiting to see, what is done in which order with priority, by CMMC. Again, we want to look back to NIST Special Publication SB 800-171, because everything you do to accomplish and improve, sustain your satisfaction of those 110 requirements is good. Some are harder than others. Some may change, but that's a great baseline to start. Finally, it's really important to be smarter and more alert to incidents and events when they occur, and to come up with processes and procedures that are responsible so that you can make a prompt determination whether there is a reportable event and that you are able to respond to that event both internally and externally when it occurs. And I think that's it. I thank everyone for their interest. I don't mean to paint, a dire picture or to be, lecturing folks about what they should do. I don't want to do that. I wish I could say that this was all great. We've got it wired. It's all done. We've reached a state of comfort. You can relax, but it's just not so. And I think that General Cardon and Mr. Carmichael are in a great position to, elaborate just how difficult the world is that we live in and why it's necessary to act to protect the security of your institutions now, contract clause or not.
Thank you very much, Bob, for those highly informative words and suggestions. And to build upon your comments, I'd like to introduce our next keynote speaker, Mr. Charles Carmichael, who is Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at FireEye Mandiant. Mandiant is the world's largest cybersecurity incident response organization. Charles leads a team, and I'm not kidding, of over 1,000 experts that have investigated and are in the process of investigating some of the highest profile breaches that you've read about this year, including SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, and Excellion. And regrettably, I think he informs us that there is so much business that they cannot almost handle it. He is an authority on nation-state actors, as you can surmise, their tactics, and the enormous challenges of addressing breaches. He has testified to the United States Congress on numerous occasions on nation-state actors and ransomware attacks. The defense industrial base is, of course, at the very top of nation-state attack vectors, and to share his very unique perspective where he actually sees these threats on a daily basis and has to remediate them. Please welcome Charles Carmichael.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sanjeev. And just a quick audio check. Can you hear me okay? And can you see me?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Well, first of all, thanks, Sanjeev, for the invitation to speak to the group, and thanks for everybody's attention today. So really what I want to do is talk about what are the real world threats that my team sees every single day. We are in this very unique position where we have the opportunity to work with thousands of organizations that unfortunately deal with cybersecurity incidents. And typically those incidents are orchestrated by a variety of actors, but probably the most two common categories of actors that we deal with are nation states, as well as financially motivated criminals that are looking for ways to monetize their intrusions. And so what I want to do is just spend a few minutes talking about the most realistic, real world types of threats that I see to government contractors and higher education organizations that we probably will all deal with to some extent, either directly ourselves or indirectly through our supply chain. So the first category of threats that I want to talk about is what we call multi-faceted extortion. And the industry is calling it ransomware, but really it's a lot more than just ransomware nowadays. What we find is that financially motivated criminals that are typically organized criminals operating out of Eastern Europe, they're looking for ways to monetize the access that they have into organizations' environments. Gone are the days where, years ago, we would see them stealing credit card information or bank account details. They just can't make enough money doing that and selling it in the black market. And, it's not as lucrative for them anymore. But what we find is they can conduct very quick intrusion operations in a matter of hours or days, and then attempt to extort an organization for an easy 7-figure or 8-figure extortion demand. And it's very common for us to see our clients, unfortunately, feel that they have no better option but to pay. And the reason why they're paying, it's not because they have bad backups. It's just because the attacks and the threats and the extortion is multifaceted at this point. So we see some organizations, they do pay because they need tools to be able to recover their systems and data. But a lot of organizations, they're paying not because they have bad backups, but because their backups aren't resilient enough to be able to recover every single server and all the data across their enterprise that was taken offline in a matter of hours. And so they pay for a tool from the threat actor to be able to scale their recovery and accelerate the process of getting back online. You got to think about organizations that just simply can't conduct business operations for hours or days or weeks or months. And that's a very realistic timeline in which organizations are taken offline. We also find that some victim organizations choose to pay because they feel like it's their obligation to prevent the further disclosure of data that was stolen from their environment. What's really common nowadays is for threat actors to create these victim naming and shaming websites where they advertise that they've hacked into company X and they post the data that was stolen from company X on the internet so that other threat actors could access it, or just really anybody could get access to the data. And so we find out a number of organizations are paying because they don't want that data being published. And as you think about the ecosystem here, the attendees that are connected today, you also think about the supply chain, and you think about business partnerships, and what we see threat actors doing from an extortion perspective is also reaching out to partners of victim organizations saying, hey, I've stolen your data by hacking into company X. And if you don't apply pressure to company X to pay this extortion demand, we're going to release your information. We sometimes see those threat actors asking those business partners for money, but that's less common today, but I'm sure that's going to change in the future. But the point being is, this is so lucrative for threat actors. Again, within a few days of an intrusion operation, they could tend to make, an easy $1 million or $5 million. And what we've actually seen is the largest publicly known extortion payment was $40 million. From our vantage point, we see a lot of $30 million payouts, $20 million payouts, $10 million payouts. So it's big money for these organizations, and just the pain in which these organizations are dealing with it is incredible. I also want to maybe just dispel a few rumors or misconceptions. I think in general, people, they grew up with the belief that if you pay a threat actor or you give into a terrorist demand, it's going to encourage further bad behavior. And that's how I grew up, and that's the belief that I had. What I've observed over the years is that, surprisingly, a lot of threat actors, when they are paid, they actually provide positive outcomes. They provide working decryption tools, and they tend to move on to the next victim as opposed to continuing to re-extort the same organization. I do anticipate that's going to change probably in the next 12 months, but over the past 2 years, that seems to be our experience. The next category of threats that I think is very relevant to the group here are the threats from the nation state actors. So, the big ones are, the threat actors originating from Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. But if you think about it, really any mature country has an offensive security capability. We just tend to see those 4 countries conduct most of or more operations in the United States than we do seeing other threat actors. And there's 2 groups that I really want to call out. The first group is a group that Mandy calls ONC2452, and I realize it's just a bunch of numbers to most people on the call. Microsoft calls the threat actor Nebelium, and really the rest of the world thinks about this threat actor as the SolarWinds threat actor. They're the group that was behind the intrusion at SolarWinds last year. They were also the group that was responsible for the intrusion against my organization that we unfortunately had to deal with and disclose in December of 2020. And what I could tell you is that group was very active in 2020. They're also very active in 2021, and they're specifically interested in data that governments have access to, as well as other organizations that have information that is relevant from a strategic perspective to the Russian government. And so we see a lot of intrusions nowadays at government contractors or government organizations so that this threat actor could get access to that information. They're very good in terms of how they break into organizations. Right now, they are mostly getting into organizations by hacking in through a supply chain. So for example, for those organizations that use Microsoft 365 for email, one way that we see them getting into those organizations is by hacking into the IT company or the services provider that set up the email infrastructure for that government entity or that government contractor. In the Microsoft terminology, they're called cloud solutions providers. And one thing that we see is that a lot of companies that set up these secure email environments don't realize that the CSP may still have administrator level access to their environments. And so the actions taken by those administrators of the company that set up the email environment may not be known to the actual organization themselves. So we highly recommend organizations check to see who still has admin access to the environment. The other threat actor that I want to really talk about, or the group that I want to talk about, are the threats emanating from Iran. We've seen them in waves over the years, and I really first personally started investigating them a lot back in 2012. And what I found back in 2012 was that these threat actors weren't very good. In fact, they actually looked like amateur kids that were hacking. They didn't quite know what they were doing. But what we've learned over the years is that they have matured their capability dramatically. They're not as good as, say, the Russians or the Chinese or the US or Israel or the UK, but they're getting better and better and better. And what's concerning to us is that we are now seeing an emergence in activity from Iran. And they have shown that they're willing to get disruptive. They're very disruptive in the Middle East, where they conduct a lot of destructive attacks to take systems and companies offline. We haven't really seen them do things like that in the Western world, but at some point in time, they probably will. And there's a geopolitical angle in which they conduct their intrusions. The final category that I want to talk about today are the insiders. And it's typically, there's really two different categories of insiders that we mostly deal with. They're the criminal types of insiders that are looking to steal data from the organizations and perhaps collaborate with threat actors on the internet. Perhaps maybe they want to steal data from those organizations and then extort them. Typically, we find these guys aren't necessarily clever criminals. They're not good cyber hackers. They're just looking for, for supplemental income, and they tend to get caught and they tend to confess when they're approached. So it's, it feels like you're dealing with lower skilled individuals from a cyber and criminal perspective. But the harder types of threats to deal with are the individuals that are aligned to other government initiatives. China has a publicly known recruitment program known as the 1,000 Talents program. And what they're doing is they're actively recruiting prominent individuals that have reputable and respected jobs at various organizations across the globe. And the ask of those people is to take intellectual property and knowledge and learnings from the organizations that they work at and bring it back to the, to essentially bring it back to China so that they could use it as part of their overall mission and objectives. And so as you think about it from their perspective, it's certainly a patriotic thing for them to do. From our perspective, we're losing intellectual property and we're losing jobs to that. There's three key takeaways that I'd like to just recommend to the group in addition to what Bob had recommended earlier. The first thing I'd recommend is organizations should really conduct red team exercises or penetration tests. Emulate the bad guys, but pay the good guys to do that. Find the vulnerabilities that exist, find the gaps in your security detection capabilities, and just do real world testing to see, can somebody break into your organization and can they get access to your sensitive data or your partner's sensitive data without getting detected? And don't feel bad if your tests prove that that could happen. Use it as an opportunity to learn and get better, and just continuously do this to get better and better over time. Number two, conduct tabletop exercises amongst your executive leadership team to figure out what would you do in the event of a security incident, something that's major enough that requires executive level visibility or perhaps board level visibility. And the third thing is try to find a way to share learnings about the attacks against your organizations with peers within your group. We all get better by learning from each other. And I realize there's a lot of reasons why we may feel uncomfortable sharing information about attacks, but I'll assure you, the more we share about attacks, the better we will all be able to be with respect to defending our nation. So Sanjeev, I appreciate the time and I'll stick around toward the end if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Charles. That was one of the clearest enunciations of what's actually going on from the perspective of a person who in an organization that's actually seeing it. A couple of points that you made about your organization itself being targeted and the security environment as it pertains to information that's in the cloud. I'd like to point out to the audience that there'll be several sessions later that will address this very issue of administrator and other forms of access to the information in the cloud and how modern technologies can address that. So please stick on for those. But moving on, we started with Bob sharing his perspectives on the regulatory environment, Charles, you sharing your perspective on what's really happening. And then let's bring it back right down to how the government and the armed forces perceive it. Our final keynote speaker this afternoon is retired Lieutenant General Ed Cardone. He's a retired 3-star general who served for over 36 years in the United States Army. And during his decades of service to the nation, General Cardone was both the commander of elite infantry fighting divisions, but also the general officer in charge of the US Army Cyber Command. As the Army's cyber commander, General Cardone was tasked with setting up cyber protection teams to protect the Army systems and network from intrusions as well as moving the Army to a more defensible platform. He was succeeded in his Cyber Command role by then Lieutenant General and now General Paul Nakasone, who's currently the commander of US Cyber Command and director of the National Security Agency. General Cardone has an unrivaled understanding of nation-state cyber capabilities because of the impact they have on the Army, but he also understands the heavy dependence of the Army on the supply chain, and so has been very intimately involved with the CMMC program. And to share his insights, please welcome General Cardone.
Sanjeev, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And Bob and Charles, those are some excellent laydowns of the landscape. I just think it's, I normally start with, first off, cyber is dynamic, not static. And so to Charles' point, what we see today, it's going to evolve, and generally it doesn't evolve in a lesser fashion, but in a more comprehensive fashion. And so if you're a CIO or a CISO, and you look at the hundreds of vendors you have to incorporate that make up the parts of a network, and the way those have to be integrated, and then you take what Bob said about deliver and compromise, you can get a sense for the scope of the problem. It's both complicated and complex. And so for me, deliver and compromise was, first off, very timely. And second, has been a sort of a seminal moment in certainly DoD, and I hope the US government approach to cybersecurity. And basically, to Bob's point, what it sort of pointed out, well, actually it didn't sort of, what it pointed out is our self-regulatory mechanism is not working. That we continue to say we're getting better, but by Charles' work with Mandiant, we can clearly tell it's not getting better. And so what can we do? And so CMMC was initially created, I believe, and Bob, you're one of the architects, and I do talk to your other co-authors, but let's have a system that has an outside look that checks it, but also let's put a better definition on what 171 means. Because when you actually read some of that language, it is widely open to interpretation on what certain things mean. And so for the last year and a half, I've been interacting with members of the CMMC, those trying to set it up both in and out of government, on how could we best do this in a way that actually brings better security to the DIB. We get focused around, oh, compliance, you did this, you did that, but in the end, what are we after? Secure weapon systems, secure networks, secure critical infrastructure. So security is there in the end, but it's in this dynamic environment. And so as we've gone forward in this, I think one of the challenges has been when you talk to some of the researchers, is there ways that we can eliminate entire classes of attack? And I think it was Bob, you that mentioned the perimeter approach, right? Well, in the beginning, we all had perimeters, right? And the problem was we're like an egg, a nice hard shell on the outside, but once through the shell, everything on the inside is quite open. And there's plenty of examples of that. Now we're past that now, but this idea of these zero trust principles came forth, and it's sort of become a buzzword, and actually it's a tremendous amount of work to set up, right? But if you think about it, if you start from the position that first, a principle of least privilege, as opposed to the way we designed all of our networks, which is everyone has access to everything for ease of operation. If we start with, we only give access to the data that people need to do their job, it starts to bring into more focus some of the things that Bob talked about. So you have to start off with, well, the first big point in anything, tons of work done on this, which is all about identity or authentication. Are you really who you say you are? And of course, lots of work been done on that, lots of improvement on that over the years. Then the second part is, and this is where I think it gets really hard, is segmenting your data. And this is where, okay, what data is most important? How do you tier that? And then how do you protect it? Obviously, the financial industry has done this quite well, but we have done this less well inside DoD up to this point. We tend to put them in data lakes, or we were moving toward data lakes, and now we need to get out of that and decide what data is most important. And this comes back around to the red team here in a little bit. I'll get to that. But this idea of segmentation, and then what level of security you got to have in that level of segmentation. And then finally, encryption. And first I thought, oh, that'll be the easy part. You know, encryption, pretty easy, 256 RSA use. And then all of a sudden you realize, well, wait, a lot of encryption, which used to be primarily provided by the government, is wide commercial encryption now. Now you have competing encryption. So back to the CIO, CISO, right? When you're trying to integrate all these people, how do you integrate different encryption systems? And then finally, how do you monitor all this to make sure it's actually working like it should? And so built correctly, I believe that a proper zero trust actually meets 171 and you'll pass anything, right? But I don't want to sit here and pretend like that's easy to do. It's actually quite difficult to separate this across, especially when you have the number of vendors and third-party accesses into your networks. So now back to where Charles started with, if you start from a position of my network is compromised or going to be compromised, and if you're in the Department of Defense, that's a great position to start, because you don't have to read very many national security strategies from other nations, two in particular. It's very clear that they view the United States as an adversary. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense that the Department of Defense is a cyber target for them. So if you make the assumption, okay, you're already under attack and it's very difficult. You know, Verizon does a great job in their report of saying how long people are in before we really know that they're in. If you operate from a position of through zero trust principles, we're going to be in a much better position than we are today. I also want to highlight something Charles said about the emerging threats. So from a tremendous articulation on extortion actors, but the national critical infrastructure and the work that's going on right now with, you know, Chris Inglis, Ann Neuberger, Jen Easterly, General Nakasone. This is fantastic, working on these 16 critical infrastructures of the United States. So sometimes we think about DOD, we only think about DOD in our warfighting systems, but these 16 critical infrastructures are essential for all of this to actually work. And so, you know, I view this as a much broader piece. Finally, I'd say two more points. One, defending alone is called losing. I love the way Charles ended with sharing the information, because I view it as for years, for a variety of reasons, liability being one of them, people try to keep secret what was happening to them, right? Now the problem is, if it's happening to you, it's probably happening to others. And if I have a little saying that I've been using, defending alone is called losing. And there's no way you can defend alone now, especially with so many different vendors in the networks and with third-party accesses, and knowing what that looks like. One thing that's been 100% of the time when we've gone into a place inside the Army or DoD networks and we think we know what that network looks like, and the first thing we do is map it, it looks different than what they told us it looked like. And that's not a good thing. So the idea that we could understand our networks and using red teams and tabletop exercises to exercise this as an operation and not as a compliance aspect, I think would be very powerful. And so I'm a big believer in CMMC because it's putting a lot of attention against this. It's going to stop what I call POAMs that are on paper, but not actually implemented. I think zero trust is pointing a direction that could take whole classes of attack off the table, and we'll be in a much better position in the future, not only for today, but in the future. And with that, Sanjeev, I'll stop there and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to extend a very big thank you to our panelists for their insights. And before I pepper you with questions, General, I'll want to say thanks very much for highlighting the need for zero trust and for your insightful comment that a well-implemented zero trust scheme will allow you to more or less breeze through. It's not an easy task through your NIST 800-171. And for those in the audience, you'll be perhaps wondering that, well, this is, what is zero trust and how can this be accomplished, etc. I'd like to draw your attention to a session at 3 p.m. today, where we have Dr. Jose Nito, who guided an organization to a cybersecurity DIBCAC audit, and their core security was implemented in large measure using zero trust principles, and the company achieved a near perfect score. So Dr. Nito will be presenting at about 3 o'clock today. So I encourage those that are interested in actually seeing what generally we're asking for, how can a small company implement these principles? Please, they do attend Dr. Nito's session at 3 p.m. today. So I'd like to start by asking a few questions. Many in the audience over here are small to medium businesses. They are part of the supply chain and often have challenges in responding to both security and compliance initiatives because they are small companies, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people. So for each of you, my first question is, what specifically would you advise a company that is a small to medium business and is perhaps holding CUI? What are the steps that you would recommend they take? And I'll start with you, Bob. How would you counsel a small to medium business? And appreciate the comments from you, Charles, after that, and General Cardone.
That's really an essential question. One of the greatest challenges facing DoD today is how to improve the security of its industrial base without imposing demands that cannot be met in terms of finances, human resources, or technology at the supplier. It is not an easy thing to both improve security in the smaller and medium-sized businesses and to afford doing so. And it's not clear at this point how many businesses can accept that challenge without considering leaving the industrial base. Putting it more positively, one of the things I expect to see in the new improvements to CMMC and DoD cyber are a variety of measures that will reduce the incentives for small business to exit the defense industrial base, and which will also make it more feasible for innovators to join that base. It's crucial to the department that it have access to small companies and the very best of technology, which often comes from innovators who are both small and non-traditional. So we have to find a way to put that circle of special circumstances and challenge into this larger square of DoD security. To me, the central way, the way to start, as I suggested earlier, is to identify what assets you have, what systems you have, what information you possess, what data you generate or receive that is most important to the current operations of your business, to your opportunities for success in the future, and that would have the greatest consequence to your customer if access to it were denied or if it were stolen. And I would begin by focusing on outcomes that can be achieved with respect to such data. What can I do to better protect it against any form of attack, whether it's a new attack at the perimeter or the attempt to exploit an already present attack, such as an advanced persistent threat that may be in the network. If you are able to, if you know what you have that's valuable and you are able to protect it and reduce the ability of adversaries to access or use it, if you're able to keep it in a fashion that is securely backed up, well, I think that you've done a good job to protect yourself against loss of the system or of the information. And I guess I would say this, for smaller and medium-sized businesses, outcomes are just so important. It is true that maybe someday, to some extent, there will be an assessment of you. but you're not going to be the priority as the CMMC apparatus comes into play. What I think will matter is taking the steps that reduce your vulnerability and mitigate the consequence in the event you're successfully attacked.
Thank you very much, Charles. How would you counsel a small to medium defense contractor on some pragmatic steps that they could be taking?
Yeah, so
And
I'll
Sanjeev,
first,
just, sorry for jumping in. I'll just know that this is our last question and then we'll need to move on to our next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I'll say, look, I certainly appreciate the challenges that smaller organizations have to deal with from a cybersecurity perspective. I'd reiterate the recommendation around conducting red team exercises, because what you're essentially doing is you're finding real world ways for threat actors to break into the network. It enables you to identify gaps in your visibility and detection processes. And I'd let the results of those red team exercises start to drive what are some of your tactical actions to improve your security posture. So you defend against the known ways in which somebody could break into your organization and get access to your data.
Pragmatic advice. Thank you again. In the interest of time, General, I won't ask you the same question. To keep the sessions moving, I'll conclude by saying big thank you to our panelists. I learned a lot and appreciate your time and participation. I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as we did. Any questions, please shoot them to us and we'll try to get answers from our distinguished panel. And with that, over to you, Orly, to keep us marching on to the next session.